The world is in complete shock tonight after what insiders are calling the most explosive royal confrontation in late-night television history. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex and global advocate for mental health awareness, walked off The Late Show with Stephen Colbert following a heated confrontation that exposed the dark reality of American media exploitation of royal trauma. What should have been a respectful discussion about Harry's charitable work and personal journey turned into a career-defining moment that revealed Stephen's calculated cruelty toward someone who had courageously opened up about his deepest pain. Make sure you smash that subscribe button because this story contains exclusive behind-the-scenes details that will make you lose all faith in late-night television's treatment of vulnerable public figures. The shocking truth about what happens when genuine royal vulnerability meets manufactured intellectual superiority goes deeper than anyone imagined, and we've got insider information that reveals the systematic exploitation of family trauma disguised as journalistic inquiry. According to sources close to the production, Prince Harry had been extremely selective about American television appearances since stepping back from royal duties, carefully choosing platforms that would treat his mental health advocacy and family situation with appropriate sensitivity. But Stephen's team had spent months convincing Harry's representatives that this would be a thoughtful conversation about his humanitarian work and his mission to break stigmas around mental health. Discussions. Harry was genuinely hesitant about doing Colbert, revealed a longtime member of the Duke's inner circle who witnessed the devastating aftermath. He's been burned by American media before, and he's very protective of his family's privacy and his own mental health journey. But Stephen's people convinced him this would be different. A serious conversation about his charity work, his military service, his mental health advocacy. They promised it would be respectful of his boundaries and his pain. The red flags started appearing during the pre-interview coordination process, but they were disguised as Stephen's supposed intellectual curiosity about Harry's unique perspective on modern monarchy and family dynamics. His producers seemed unusually interested in Harry's most painful family moments, his relationship with his father and brother, and what they described as the psychology behind his decision to leave royal life. They kept pushing for details about Harry's family relationships, his feelings about his father becoming king, his brother's reaction to the memoir, explained a publicist familiar with the negotiation process. They claimed they wanted to explore the human side of monarchy, the emotional cost of royal duty. We thought it was Stephen wanting to have a deeper conversation about the intersection of public service and personal well-being. Behind the scenes, crew members described an atmosphere that felt more like preparation for an interrogation than a respectful interview with someone who had courageously shared his trauma to help others. Stephen was reportedly obsessing over the most controversial excerpts from Harry's memoir, studying family disputes that had been made public, and preparing what staff described as surprisingly invasive questions about his most painful experiences. Stephen had this massive research file about every family conflict Harry had discussed publicly, every detail about his mother's death, his struggles with his father and brother, recalled a production assistant who witnessed the disturbing preparations, but he wasn't studying it to understand Harry's journey or support his mental health work. He was looking for the most emotionally triggering topics he could bring up for maximum dramatic effect. What made the situation even more dangerous was Stephen's well-documented pattern of using intellectual authority to justify cruel questioning, particularly toward public figures who had made themselves vulnerable by sharing personal struggles. Industry insiders revealed that the late-night host has a history of weaponizing people's openness about trauma, viewing emotional honesty as material for his sophisticated analysis rather than respecting it as courage. Stephen has this thing about people who've shared their mental health struggles publicly, explained a former show writer who left after becoming uncomfortable with the host's increasingly exploitative tactics. He thinks it makes them fair game for any kind of questioning because they chose to make it public. He especially targets people like Harry whose vulnerability threatens his intellectual superiority. He can't understand that sharing trauma to help others is brave, not weak. The tension escalated when Harry arrived at the studio, bringing his characteristic blend of royal dignity and hard-won emotional honesty. Witnesses described the Duke as being cautiously optimistic about the interview, hoping to discuss his Invictus, games work and mental health initiatives, while perhaps inspiring others who were struggling with family trauma or mental health challenges. But Stephen's behavior during their pre-show meeting immediately raised red flags among staff who understood the respect that should be shown to someone who had suffered such public family trauma. Harry was being his usual thoughtful self, talking about his charity work and his hope that sharing his story might help other people, observed a stage manager who's worked with countless high-profile guests. But Stephen was asking these really probing questions about his family relationships, his feelings about his father's coronation, stuff that was clearly painful for Harry to discuss. Behind closed doors, makeup artists and wardrobe staff noticed that Stephen kept steering conversations toward Harry's most sensitive topics, probing for emotional reactions about his mother's death, his military service trauma, and his fractured relationships with his royal family. He kept bringing up Diana, asking about Harry's feelings toward Camilla, questioning whether he regretted leaving royal life, revealed a makeup artist who worked with both men. Harry was trying to redirect to his charitable work, but Stephen seemed obsessed with getting emotional reactions about his family pain. The backstage atmosphere grew increasingly tense as showtime approached. Harry, with his hard-earned sensitivity to media manipulation and exploitation, began picking up on Stephen's barely concealed agenda to weaponize his vulnerability for television content. Meanwhile, Stephen was reportedly making final preparations for what crew members later described as a systematic attack on someone's most protected emotional territory. "You could feel the exploitation building," described an audience coordinator who helped seat guests before the taping. Stephen was planning to ambush someone who had courageously shared his trauma to help others, to use Harry's openness against him for dramatic television. It felt like watching someone prepare to re-traumatize a person who had already suffered enough public humiliation. As the cameras prepared to roll and Harry took his position with characteristic composed dignity, production assistants were already expressing horror about what they feared was about to happen. The collision between Harry's vulnerable authenticity and Stephen's intellectual exploitation was about to create a television moment that would expose the difference between genuine courage in sharing trauma and manufactured drama designed to exploit human pain. Nobody could have predicted just how viciously Stephen would attack someone's most protected emotional wounds, or how powerfully Harry would respond when his family trauma was weaponized for American entertainment. What unfolded next will be remembered as one of the most shocking displays of intellectual cruelty toward royal vulnerability in television history. As the cameras rolled and Stephen delivered his opening monologue, viewers immediately sensed something predatory in his energy, the calculated superiority of someone preparing to weaponize a public figure's most painful family trauma for sophisticated entertainment. When he introduced Prince Harry, his tone carried an undercurrent of barely concealed anticipation that made everyone who understands human decency feel sick to their stomachs. Please welcome a man who's redefined what it means to be royal in the 21st century, though his family might have some thoughts about that redefinition. Prince Harry. The introduction was loaded with ominous undertones that immediately signaled this wasn't going to be a respectful discussion of Harry's humanitarian work. When the Duke walked onto the stage with his characteristic blend of royal composure and hard-won emotional authenticity, the contrast between his genuine vulnerability and Stephen's hidden exploitation agenda was disturbing to witness. The interview began with seemingly standard questions about Harry's mental health advocacy work, but viewers who understand manipulative interview tactics could see Stephen laying elaborate emotional traps with surgical precision. Harry, with his natural openness about his healing journey and his genuine desire to help others struggling with similar trauma, responded with the kind of honest reflection that has made his mental health work so impactful. "You know, Harry, you've been incredibly brave about sharing your personal struggles," Stephen said with a smile that looked more like a clinical examination. "The therapy, the family conflicts, the decision to step back from royal duties. It's really quite fascinating from a psychological perspective. Tell me, when you look back at everything that's happened, your mother's death, the media scrutiny, the family tensions, do you ever wonder if you've processed it all correctly?" The way Stephen framed Harry's trauma recovery as something to be questioned and analyzed was like a verbal assault on his healing journey. He had reduced years of painful therapy and emotional growth to intellectual curiosity, treating Harry's courage in addressing his mental health as material for sophisticated discussion, rather than respecting it as genuine healing work. Harry's composure flickered slightly as he processed the unexpected clinical framing of his personal journey. "Stephen, I think everyone processes trauma differently," he replied with measured grace. "What matters is that people get the help they need, and hopefully use their experiences to help others. That's why I share my story, not for analysis, but to let people know they're not alone." The response was pure Harry, focused on helping others rather than defending himself, turning the conversation toward service rather than sensation. Any decent interviewer would have celebrated this perspective and used it to highlight the importance of mental health advocacy. But Stephen Colbert isn't interested in mental health advocacy, and what he did next revealed his complete lack of respect for someone's healing journey. "Help others, absolutely," Stephen said with mock thoughtfulness that made several audience members shift uncomfortably. "Though I have to ask, and I hope you don't mind me being intellectually curious here, but don't you think there's something almost therapeutic about having such a public platform to discuss your family issues? I mean, writing a memoir about your father and brother doing interviews about your childhood trauma. Is that healing? Or is that just a very sophisticated form of family therapy conducted in public?" The studio fell into uncomfortable silence. Stephen had just suggested that Harry's courage in sharing his story to help others was really just public family therapy, reducing his mental health advocacy to a selfish psychological exercise. The cruel implication that his vulnerability was performative rather than genuine hit the air like an assault on everyone who had ever found hope in his openness. Those sitting close to the stage could see Harry's jaw tighten as he realized he wasn't dealing with someone interested in understanding his mission, but with someone who wanted to psychoanalyze his trauma for entertainment. "Stephen, sharing my story wasn't therapy for me," he said with controlled intensity. "It was about breaking down the stigma that prevents people from getting help. If that helps people, then the personal cost was worth it." Stephen, apparently energized by having struck a nerve with someone whose vulnerability threatened his intellectual superiority, doubled down with the kind of calculated cruelty that would define his downfall. "Personal cost. Interesting phrase. Speaking of cost, and forgive me for being direct here, but what about the cost to your family? Your father, who just became king, having to deal with public criticism from his son. Your brother William, having private conversations published for the world to read. Don't you think there's something almost selfish about healing your trauma at their expense?" The attack on Harry's right to tell his own story and the suggestion that protecting his mental health was selfish was breathtaking in its cruel ignorance. Stephen had just argued that Harry should have suffered in silence to protect the people who had contributed to his trauma, weaponizing family loyalty against someone's right to heal. Harry sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his royal training warring with his hard-won commitment to emotional honesty. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled power of someone whose healing journey had been attacked by someone who had never faced real trauma. "Stephen, with respect, you're talking about my family," he said quietly, but everyone could hear the warning underneath. "These aren't abstract concepts for intellectual discussion. These are real relationships, real pain, real healing. I didn't share my story to hurt anyone. I shared it because staying silent was killing me. But Stephen wasn't interested in respecting Harry's boundaries or acknowledging the courage it took to break generational cycles of emotional suppression. He was interested in mining the deepest veins of royal family dysfunction for sophisticated entertainment, and he wasn't finished with his systematic assault on Harry's most protected emotional territory. "Killing you? That's powerful language," Stephen said with mock concern that made the exploitation even more obvious. "And I understand. The pain was real. But let's talk about the aftermath. Your father reportedly didn't speak to you for months. William has barely acknowledged your existence since the memoir came out. Even your grandmother's final years were overshadowed by family drama. Looking at all that damage, do you ever wonder if there might have been a more private way to process your grief?" The suggestion that Harry was responsible for damaging his family relationships by refusing to suffer in silence was so fundamentally cruel that several audience members looked genuinely disturbed. Stephen had just blamed someone for the consequences of telling the truth about their own trauma, arguing that protecting dysfunctional family systems was more important than individual mental health. Harry's famous composure was hanging by a thread now as he processed the systematic attack on his right to heal and speak his truth. When he finally responded, his voice carried the dangerous quiet of someone whose deepest wounds had been weaponized for entertainment. "You know what, Stephen?" he said slowly, his royal dignity now backed by hard-earned emotional strength. "I came here thinking I was going to talk about helping people. Instead, you're using my family trauma as material for your show. That's exactly the kind of exploitation that drove me away from royal life in the first place." The rebuke hung in the air like a judgment on everything Stephen represented. And for a moment, it seemed like the host might realize he had crossed every line of human decency. But instead of showing any trace of respect for Harry's boundaries, he made the mistake that would trigger the most explosive royal confrontation in television history. The fallout from Prince Harry's dignified exit began before he even reached his security detail outside the studio. Within minutes, cell phone footage from horrified audience members was exploding across every social media platform on Earth. Despite CBS Security's desperate attempts to contain what they knew was the most career-destroying royal incident in television history. By the time Harry had left the building, still radiating the moral authority that comes from defending human dignity against exploitation, Stephen attacked Harry was trending globally with over 400 million views in the first 2 hours alone, making it the most watched defense of trauma survivors against media exploitation in internet history. What happened backstage in those crucial moments has been described by witnesses as both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. "Harry wasn't angry when he got to the back area," revealed a crew member who was deeply affected by the encounter. "He was just sad. He kept saying, 'I thought Americans were different,' and 'why do they always bring up my mother?' Even after being brutally re-traumatized on television, he was still thinking about other trauma survivors who might have been watching, worried that the attack might discourage them from seeking help." Meanwhile, Stephen sat alone on his destroyed stage as the studio audience filed out in unprecedented fury at what they had witnessed. Unlike previous incidents, people weren't just supporting Harry. They were genuinely disgusted at witnessing the exploitation of someone's grief and trauma for entertainment. Several audience members actually confronted Stephen on their way out, with one veteran shouting, "That man served his country and lost his mother, and you attacked him for it." The emotional confrontation would later become a viral video with over 200 million views. Behind closed doors at CBS, emergency meetings were already declaring the complete annihilation of Stephen's career as executives realized they were facing the most catastrophic incident involving global royalty in network history. "This wasn't just bad publicity," disclosed a network insider who witnessed the executive panic firsthand. "This was Stephen attacking someone whose mother's death traumatized the entire world, someone whose mental health advocacy has saved lives. He had just revealed himself as someone who re-traumatizes trauma survivors for entertainment. His career was over before Harry even left the building. But the real earthquake came when Prince Harry's representatives released a statement that united not just the Commonwealth but the entire world against Stephen Colbert. Unlike typical celebrity damage control, this response carried the moral weight of defending trauma survivors everywhere against media exploitation. The Duke of Sussex came tonight to discuss his mental health advocacy and charitable work, the statement read. Instead, he was subjected to a deliberate attempt to re-traumatize him using his mother's death and family pain as entertainment material. What happened tonight represents everything wrong with media exploitation of vulnerable public figures. The revelation that Stephen had systematically weaponized the death of Princess Diana and Harry's family trauma completely united every corner of global culture against him. Within hours, not just British subjects but trauma survivors, mental health advocates, and ordinary people worldwide began expressing their outrage at what they had witnessed. Protect Trauma Survivors became a rallying cry that transcended politics and nationality into a global defense of human dignity. The British response was unprecedented in its speed and fury. The royal family, which rarely comments on media coverage, issued a rare statement expressing their deep concern about the exploitation of family tragedy for entertainment. Every major British media outlet condemned Stephen's tactics, and Parliament members from both parties criticized American television's treatment of a British prince who had served his country in combat. Perhaps the most powerful response came from trauma survivors and mental health advocates worldwide. Organizations that work with bereaved children, military veterans with PTSD, and families affected by media harassment began sharing testimonials about how Harry's openness had helped them. Their stories created an overwhelming narrative that Stephen had attacked not just one man, but everyone who had ever found hope in Harry's courage to speak about trauma. The global entertainment industry's response revealed a shocking divide between those who understood trauma recovery and those who saw everything as content. While American talk show hosts remained largely silent, actual mental health professionals, trauma therapists, and humanitarian organizations began publicly defending Harry's right to heal without being re-traumatized. What Stephen did was unconscionable, said the head of a major PTSD treatment center whose comment went viral. Harry's openness about his trauma has saved lives. Attacking him for that courage is attacking every person who's ever sought help for their pain. The ratings collapse was immediate and total. Stephen's show lost 99% of its international audience within 24 hours, the most catastrophic audience loss in television history. Every major British advertiser pulled their sponsorship immediately, understanding that association with someone who had attacked Princess Diana's grieving son was commercial suicide. The British government even issued a diplomatic protest about the treatment of a member of their royal family. Meanwhile, Harry experienced something unprecedented in royal history: global recognition not just as a prince, but as a defender of trauma survivors who had successfully stood up to media exploitation. His mental health foundation received record donations, his Invictus Games for wounded veterans gained worldwide support, and trauma survivors everywhere saw him as proof that healing was possible even after public re-traumatization. Harry showed us what real courage looks like, posted one trauma survivor whose comment received 50 million likes. He didn't just defend himself. He defended every person who's ever been told their trauma isn't real, every person who's been re-traumatized by people who should know better. Stephen tried to break him, and Harry showed the world what unbreakable looks like. The sentiment was echoed billions of times as people shared their own stories of trauma and healing. The incident sparked what historians are calling the Diana moment, a global reckoning with media treatment of grieving public figures and trauma survivors. Universities began teaching courses on ethical interviewing of vulnerable subjects. Journalism schools rewrote their guidelines about exploiting personal tragedy, and trauma treatment centers started using Harry's response as an example of maintaining dignity under attack. 4 years later, the consequences have reshaped both global media ethics and Stephen's legacy permanently. The Late Show was quietly canceled within 6 months, and Stephen has become the most universally despised figure in international media. His attack on Harry is cited as the moment when American television revealed its willingness to re-traumatize anyone for entertainment. No major public figure will associate with him, and his name has become synonymous with media cruelty toward trauma survivors. Harry, meanwhile, has been elevated beyond royal status to something approaching global sainthood. Among trauma survivors, he's received humanitarian awards from organizations worldwide. His mental health work is now considered foundational to modern trauma treatment, and his approach to maintaining dignity under attack has become the gold standard for public figures. Facing media exploitation. The United Nations appointed him as a special ambassador for trauma survivors' rights. Sometimes you have to choose between protecting your peace and protecting others who might be watching, he said in his only extended comment about the incident during a recent global mental health summit. When someone tries to re-traumatize you for entertainment, walking away isn't weakness. It's showing other survivors that their healing matters more than anyone else's content. That's the lesson I hope people take from this. Your recovery is sacred, and no one has the right to weaponize your pain for their gain. The quote has been translated into every language and is now taught in trauma therapy programs worldwide. The Prince Harry versus Stephen Colbert showdown will be remembered as the moment when trauma survivor dignity triumphed over media exploitation, when royal authority defended human vulnerability, and when one man's refusal to be re-traumatized exposed the difference between genuine journalism and sadistic entertainment. It proved that attacking someone's grief and healing journey will always have consequences, and that authentic courage in facing trauma will always be more powerful than intellectual cruelty disguised as curiosity. What did you think about this devastating attack on a trauma survivor's healing journey? Was Stephen's weaponization of Diana's death and Harry's family pain the most evil moment in television history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, smash that subscribe button for more shocking celebrity revelations, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that expose the difference between ethical journalism and exploitative entertainment designed to re-traumatize vulnerable people.